Welcome to the Do No Harm podcast, where we discuss the battle to keep politics out of medicine, with our host, Dr. Marilyn Singleton, and Do No Harm's founder, Dr. Stanley Goldfarb. Together, we're talking with people to create a better healthcare system for all, one that's based on medicine, not division.
In 2021, Dr. Tabia Lee was hired to lead the DEI department at Silicon Valley's Anza College. A Black woman, she was a seemingly perfect fit the role. But she says the reality was far different. Dr. Lee began cultivating an authentically inclusive learning environment at the college, something that should be in line with what's expected of the diversity, equity, and inclusion department head. But as it turns out, the college didn't want to create an inclusive environment at all. They were more concerned with embracing a toxic form of DEI, which Dr. Lee calls critical social justice. Dr. Lee was accused of, I love this term, white-splaining, and not being the right kind of Black person. She was vilified for refusing to invoke racial stereotypes and for her refusal to kowtow to the white supremacy culture that some of her colleagues were committed to focusing on. In 2023, Dr. Lee was fired from her tenure-track position. She has since become an outspoken advocate for removing toxic DEI initiatives from higher education, warning that by continuing to focus on these programs, there will be no true diversity or inclusion. Welcome to the show, Dr. Lee.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, Stan, Dr. Goldfarb, why don't you start off giving our interrogation of Dr. Lee?
Well, welcome, Dr. Lee. Great to talk with you again.
Yeah.
So perhaps the best way to start is to start from the beginning. Tell us exactly what happened at Anza College and how you came to go there and what happened to you once you were there.
Yes, Dr. Goldfarb. So I am a lifelong educator. Teaching and the teaching profession is, that's my vocation. I sometimes joke with people that I've been teaching as long as I've been going to school myself. And, of course, I got formal training and ended up teaching gifted English language learners. I taught English, civics, and social studies for 10 years in East Los Angeles public middle schools. At that same time, I was doing teacher training around technology, around understanding giftedness as a neurodiversity, and just really always trying to work to improve the teaching craft, both for myself and for my colleagues, serving as a co-learner and trying to see how can we best serve, the students who our communities entrust us with, to educate and to engage with for 6 to 8 hours of their day, on a daily basis. So after I completed my doctorate in educational leadership and administration, and I was always a teacher leader, never focused on actually going into, being a paper pusher, nothing against administrators and principals, but my leadership focus was around what happens in the trenches and in the classroom. And so I traveled outside of the U.S. for a bit. I began a job search with which many people who've completed their doctorate can relate to. Didn't go quite as planned. Spent many years trying to get a tenure-track position, which is why I got a doctorate in education. I wanted to help, be a teacher educator at a larger scale than just my small classroom or, my middle school position as a faculty member there. And I spent many years as an adjunct in teacher training programs. And then finally in 2020, I had my first opening into a higher education position, but it was a temporary position as a faculty instructional designer. Because if we all recall, during the pandemic, there was this rush to get everybody's classes online. And so these positions opened in the community college space, and I did that for 1 year. And then, I'm kind of putting everything in a brief, concise way of a long, this is decades of experience. And so after that temporary position ended, I saw this opening for a faculty director for the Office of Equity, Social Justice, and Multicultural Education at Anza College. And I, of course, applied to that because those were three topics that I have always focused on in my career and in my teacher trainings and professional development that I had made prior to that. And so I applied, went through a very rigorous process involving multiple panels, teaching demonstrations, and I actually landed that position. So that's what brought me to Anza College at that time.
And then what?
Okay, so yes, how are we sitting here talking today? So what happened when I began that position was almost immediately, I come into things with an inquiry-based approach always. I never assume that I know what the needs are or what people, want to see manifested in their organization or environment. So I did at the beginning of my position at Anza, 60 hours of needs assessment conversations. And I don't think I would have been able to do that large amount of conversations with people if we were in the face-to-face environment. So we were all still online in 2021 here in California. So I was able to touch base with senior leadership, faculty, staff. No students during my needs assessment because I was just so new and I didn't even know how to even connect with students at the very beginning. And so I heard from people. I heard their concerns. They, told me perceptions about my office, perceptions about the school. How could we make it a more inclusive environment? Because that was one of my primary job duties, was to promote a more inclusive environment, as listed in the job description. Also, one of the staff members in the Office of Equity, Social Justice, and Multicultural Education, this is 2 weeks in, told me that they had been a finalist for the position and that they were heartbroken that they were not selected. They were a former student at Anza. They didn't know who I was or where I was coming from or what my commitment to equity was. And they assured me that I would have a rough ride ahead because they felt entitled to my job. And that person delivered. It was about a few weeks after that at a staff meeting that I was holding with the office. This person, as I was talking about a Google Doc and I was telling, the team, I'm new here and it would be great if we just started to become more strategic about, the way that we plan things, because they had no agendas for meetings. It was just very conversational. And this had gone on, for a few weeks. And I said, so here's a Google Doc. We can all edit it. We can start tracking what are our agendas. We can start to track ways we can collaborate. What are activities and programs you typically run? How would you like me to support you or, to be able to contribute to those? And as I was saying that, the staff member that assured me I would have the rough ride said, stop what you're doing. Immediately stop talking, and the person said, what you're doing right now is you're white speaking and you're white splaining and you're supporting white supremacy. And I had never had anyone tell me or say those kinds of things to me. I had never heard the term white speaking or white splaining in my entire career as an educator. No one in any setting had ever used that term. And certainly no one had ever accused me of supporting white supremacy or being a white supremacist. And when that was said, there were these gleeful looks on the call from the other folks that were in the meeting. And I felt very hurt when that was said. And I said, I haven't come in here and I haven't called anyone names. And that's not my style, to engage in name calling. I said, and what you just said hurts me, because I told them where I grew up and that I had encountered actual, white supremacists in my small town that I grew up in. And that I definitely was not a white supremacist or someone who, was here to behave as a white National Socialist. And I said, I don't think we should engage with each other that way. And please don't use those words like that to me again. And instantly on the call, the other people that were there looked shocked, as though what I said when I said, please don't say that, and the reason why was an injury to the person who had said those remarks. I felt like I was in a twilight zone, and they were very real about that. And so what I ended up doing was I went to my supervising dean, because I have no supervisory capacity. I was a faculty director. So my position was a tenure-track faculty role, and I had no supervisory capacity or anything like that. The supervisor was the dean of the department. And I told the dean about what had taken place in the meeting. The affect that the dean had when I told him about it was very flat. And the dean actually said, I think you misunderstood. And he said, but I'll ask the person to apologize to you. And I said, okay, I don't think I misunderstood. I explained, same things I had explained to the group, the things I just shared with you here. And I said, and I don't think that that's a way for folks to speak to each other. That's not a constructive way to engage. I said, the team needs someone to come in to talk about in-group bias, to talk about how do we engage in effective intercultural communication and professional communication. And I said, and I would really appreciate it if you would get someone to do that. I said, there's a clear need for it and it's immediate. I'm seeing it out the gate. And I said, she said, the dean said they would not be willing to do that. And not only that, they just they think it was just a big misunderstanding. And I said, well, if that's how you're perceiving this, I then would like for you to come to the meetings and to ensure a space of civil dialogue where there is no name calling and where we can speak and work in a constructive way. And what happened, unfortunately, was the supervising dean did begin to attend. And the dynamic was that they became the ringleader for an environment of hostility. Every meeting, very hostile in tone. Anytime we spoke about, initiatives addressing things that the community had brought to us as problems, it was the dean saying, oh, no, I agree, with the other staff members, and then basically ganging up on me in each meeting and, saying we don't do that here. For example, one of the things we didn't do purportedly was to address anti-Semitism. And so I had no support from my supervising dean. In fact, that person became a ringleader for a lot of the actions and inaction of the office. I never saw my budget or knew what kind of budget my office had. And that's the dynamics that were set up from the start.
Dr. Lee, how did they come to tell you you were the wrong kind of Black person or not the right kind of Black person? What is the right kind of Black person? Yeah, I'd really like to know.
I would too, it wasn't until a few weeks later as I went to presentations that were hosted by these individuals. They kept referencing this white supremacy, put up a slide that had these poison bottles on it. But one time it had a citation. So of course I immediately grabbed that and I went and I looked up the work. It was the slide actually comes from Tima Okun and Kenneth Jones, and they call it Dismantling Racism, was a white paper that they had written. And I was able to read it. And when I saw that, I was so mortified by what they were saying. So basically, the white supremacy culture characteristics that these people were attributing to me include things like being on time, being objective, worship of the written word, so all of these things that I had embodied in practice and taught my teachers to embody in practice and my students, to embody in practice. These were being labeled as white supremacy culture characteristics. So they're like personality traits. This group of people were weaponizing it, not just against me, but other faculty members, it turns out. So, you will be labeled a white supremacist if you were on time, if you read, if you set agendas for meetings. And I didn't know that was the kind of environment that I was walking into. And it was so hurtful to me because as I read it and understood what they were saying, I said, oh my goodness, these people, their expectation of me as a racialized Black woman is that I'm slovenly, that I do not read, that I have no capacity to be objective, and that I would be all the opposite of whatever the white supremacy culture characteristics are. And that was such a low expectation for what they call BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous people of color, the same people that they claim they want to uplift. They're expecting them to be the opposite, which would be basically someone who's not successful in American society and who has no capacity to be so, and who needs to be coddled and infantilized. And that was so disrespectful to me at the core. And as I talked with people, they would make comments to me like, wow, they wanted a Black person in this position, but you're the wrong kind of Black. They weren't expecting this kind of Black person. And these were colleagues who were like mentors and friends, and talking about the toxicity of the environment and the fact that they would allude to, a hiring taking place purely on immutable characteristics, on the race of the person. I thought I was selected for the merit and for my, for my scholarship and for my work in communities and the awards I had received, from boards of education and so forth. That's why I thought I was selected. But it turns out I was a pawn in a game of hirings that were, purely based on race factors. And it speaks to the toxicity of those kinds of practices and the environment that people find themselves in when organizations are using that.
So what bothers me about this is what happens to the students? Aren't you supposed to be there to educate them so they can get a job? And all these characteristics that have this negative patina over it are things that everybody needs to get a job and keep a job. Do they really think employers are going to want people who don't show up to work on time or can read or can write? It's stunning to me because they're supposed to be educators.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that was, one of the things that was mentioned to me was that their student scores had just flatlined over 20 years. And, their initiatives they were doing didn't seem to be working or impacting students in a positive way. And then one time I noticed as we were looking at enrollment, I said, oh, no one's talking about this, but do you all notice that white enrollment has dropped significantly here at the school? Do you think that could be related to some of our practices or maybe the way we engage students? And I was told you are not to focus on that. You need to focus on continuing to build programs for BIPOC people. And so it was like it wasn't important that enrollment job was there. But to me, that's something in the data, right? I'm a data-focused person. When it's available and we're looking at it, I'm looking at the trends. But even in those exercises, me asking questions like that, like what's going on with that? And why do we think it might be the case? I'm there, right, to promote and increase inclusion. I should be concerned if there's a drop in a particular population that's there, right? But that was never addressed. And in fact, I received from my supervising dean multiple communications of things saying, this is a workshop that we recommend for people. And the workshops had titles like Decentering Whiteness and, other titles of that nature. And also, everyone in the department should do this training on implicit bias, and then when I pointed out that implicit bias, was a not well vetted construct, and I didn't understand why, our community college district, so this came from the chancellor's office, was recommending everyone complete something like that, and how would it be helpful to us and our students? I was told this is what we're doing, this is what we're committed to. And then around the topic of anti-Semitism, this topic came up again. We had a group called the Equity Action Council. And early on, one of the community partners that I had made contact with in the needs assessment conversations brought to the Equity Action Council concerns about the treatment of Jewish students on campus, Jewish students, faculty, and staff. And they presented to the Equity Action Council requests, written recommendations of things that we could do to make the campus more inclusive. And the Action Council chose not to act on it. They said, we'll throw this back to the, faculty director and the team, and they'll come back to us and tell us what we found. So when I went to my team, and at this point, the supervising dean is also attending the meetings, and I said, these are the recommendations. What are we going to do about it? The response I received was so disheartening. I was told we're going to do nothing about it. And I said, well, why? Not any of these recommendations. One of the recommendations was about a website that we had that said we stand against racism and injustice. And they had on the website Black Lives Matter Global Foundation flags and banners. They had Stop AAPI Hate. And so the presenters that came to the Equity Action Council said, will you please just add a little statement there saying, we stand against anti-Semitism. And they cited the rise in anti-Semitism. Our community had several instances where there was anti-Semitic flyers dropped all over and plastered all over the campus. Our student government, we had a Jewish student union. This is all before I came, things that people told me about. Our student government did not adopt a definition of anti-Semitism that was advanced by two students from the Jewish Student Union. Instead, there were these really contested meetings where the Jewish students were shouted down, where chants like "From the river to the sea" were yelled at them. And then the student body actually ended up not only not adopting the definition of anti-Semitism they recommended, they ended up issuing a condemnation of Israel, which was like, how is that even related? So by the time I arrived, there was no longer a Jewish student union, and there was these groups coming and saying, hey, we need to address the problem of the hostility here.
So I guess what you say, it sounds horrible, obviously. But of course, we've heard some of this from around the country. None of this is completely unique to the Anza College. And so it sort of has raised this debate that's ongoing, whether DEI can survive, whether it should survive, whether we should have a totally different sort of approach to the world, treating people as individuals and getting rid of this so-called identity politics. But as someone who's clearly an expert in this whole area, what do you think about that? Is it something to be altered, or is it something to be abandoned and in favor of some radically different approach to individuality?
Yes, Dr. Goldfarb. So I really wanted to understand the environment I was in. And what I realized, so this is this is in 2021. So now a lot more people, even people who were in denial, are more aware of what's happening with respect to anti-Semitism on campuses. But it wasn't on CNN and Fox and MSNBC at this time like it is now. We didn't have the pro-Hamas marches in the street and, people on campus putting glory to the martyrs and all of these other things happening at this point in time. So this is things seem to be shifting so rapidly, our reality that we live in, that sometimes it becomes hard to distinguish. So what I was doing at that time, I really wanted to understand, because it didn't have a name of the ideology that these people were working from. Part of my work in the early 2000s, I coined the term ideology in practice, and I used that in teacher trainings and professional development to help teachers understand that when we teach, when we're in a classroom, when we select curricula, when we engage with our communities and students, we embody and enact ideologies, political, social, religious, all kinds of ways of viewing the world are embodied in that. And having teachers to become more aware of the ideologies that they embody is key to transforming the way we teach and understanding the way we teach and engage with others. That was part of my background in coming into this. And that's why I ended up coming up with this idea of critical social justice versus a classical social justice approach. I realized that we were all talking about social justice and committed to it, but we were meaning different things when we said that. And the distinction between the two is so critical, because in 2020, we had this catalyst around social justice because of events that happened in our American society. We had organizations pressured immediately. You need to act. We can't go on the same way, right? I'm sure we all recall these statements being made in our boards and in our organizations and so forth. And so we had schools shifting their missions. We had churches and clergy bodies saying, oh, we're going to, we're committed too. But what no one was doing was asking, what do we mean when we say social justice? Are we meaning, what are we seeking as the outcome? The bottom line, like what is the push for justice for in our setting? No one looked at that, the philosophical roots. And I think that was a big detriment to everybody because we adopted on, right? My organization is not going to be the only one that says we're not committed, that we're going to be silent on social justice when everyone around us is, rioting in the streets and demanding it, at that point in time. And so people signed on to things hastily. They didn't think it through and they didn't look at the roots of what they were speaking of. And I assert that a critical social justice approach that was a fringe in many colleges and universities and fringe departments. A lot of people didn't even know, about these kind of approaches. They became mainstreamed and they were adopted by corporations. They were adopted by medical groups. They were adopted by, civic organizations. Everyone was saying we're committed to social justice and changing up their goals and metrics and so forth to align with that without knowing what they were doing and what they were committing to. And so that's why my work now involves really helping people understand what is the difference between different approaches to social justice. I'm not someone who says, get rid of social justice. I mean, that sounds, I don't know. I don't know about that perspective. There are some people who hold that and who believe that, but I don't think it's something that's feasible. Now we've gone so far down the path that, when you change your whole mission as an organization, as a school of education, as a medical school, and, you make this part of your governing body, bylaws and principles, it's very hard to pull back from that. So now I would love to see, to answer your question, Dr. Goldfarb, some clarity from these organizations who have jumped onto the bandwagon and saying and stating openly, we're using only a critical social justice approach, or we're using only a classical social justice approach, or we welcome both approaches. I'm not hearing that from people. I'm hearing a default. And if anyone speaks against that critical perspective, that critical social justice perspective, they're cast out. They lose friends they've had for decades. They may lose their livelihood and employment because the advocates and the activists around that, they use intimidation and bullying tactics and silencing tactics. That's exactly what happened to me in my tenure review process, because the people who were leading it were proponents of this critical social justice ideological approach. And they did not want any space for any other perspective to be there. I was told that directly. I was told I was leading people to danger by some of the people I cited. I was told that by the activities I was doing with trying to get people to define what is diversity, what is equity, what is inclusion on our campus. I was told that was wrong for me to do and that there was no space for that. And I was undermining by even getting people together to talk. And so those are the kind of environments that we're seeing produced in this default that has really seized the moment and placed itself in so many places.
Well, I see that you have a website, Race Ideologies resource site, and it sounds like that site will help people look at different ways to really pull the races together and get everybody out there in the public and in all sorts of jobs, which seems to be you should have some sort of, as you point out, an ultimate goal of defining what it means to have social justice. So tell us about your site and some of the resources that you put out there.
Yes. So that was actually a work product that developed during my time at Anza College. One of the things that I discovered when we would talk about racial equity, and I was trying to, understand what people meant when they said that, I realized that when I encountered the work of Dr. Sheena Mason, she has what she calls the theory of racelessness. I encountered her work. That work was published in 2021, I believe. And when I encountered this book that she had written, I went through my own sort of reckoning with the book. This book, if you saw my copy of it, I have like so many sticky notes and notes in it and notes in the margin, because this caused me to realize that everything I have been taught about race, I apologize, 2022, was flawed. I had never been taught in my entire career and in this space that there were different philosophies of race and understanding race. No one had ever mentioned that to me. And in my educational experience, no one had ever mentioned it. In fact, she was the only one that was talking about different ways to view race and educating people about it at that time. So I wrestled with that. I contacted her, and I actually ended up, against great adversity, bringing her to our first professional development that was face-to-face in 2022. And there was a lot of undermining, people saying, just from the idea of it, she calls it a case for anti-racism in her book. And she asserts that the problem that we've all been grappling with, we've been looking at the wrong thing. We've been looking at race and obsessing with race instead of looking at racism, which was invented, race was invented to support that. I brought her to the professional development, and I just want to share one of the comments that was made because it was so telling. So as she was talking about her perspective, which she calls it skeptical eliminativist, she says race is not real and we should do away with the construct completely. We shouldn't focus on it. We should fight racism, which is the issue, but not race. And we shouldn't be focused on race identity checkboxes. That's her, in a nutshell, her perspective. One of the speakers in the Q&A who spoke for the whole group, and this was something also that you'll often see in these critical social justice environments, only one person speaks for everyone and everyone else is silent. They said, we disagree with everything you said. And I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't see a poll or anything. I'm there in the session. So that was kind of weird. And they said, but the problem is you're talking about getting rid of race. What would we do without race? We need race. That explains how privilege and oppression works. And that explains, how we're all in this system that we need to break free of. Like, we need race to exist. And that was such a telling comment and moment, because that approach needs race and gender identity check boxes. Without those boxes and without people believing in them, without people promoting them, they have nothing under the hood. There's nothing there. It's empty. It's division. They need the constant strife, conflict, division, Hegelian dialect. They need that to exist. So when you take away that and people become more informed and educated, that there is really actually one race, biologically been proven. I'm not a biologist, but I've seen the research that says that. And that these check boxes are inventions that keep morphing and changing over time. If you look at the census, you can see that in America. One group is white one time, and then they're, something else another time. And then we take this group out and we put this group in, and all of it is just the way it's enacted now in today's world. It's division and it's conflict based on that. It's competing for resources based on that. And at the bottom line, the skeptical eliminative perspective of her and others, I discovered this is a whole field. So I immediately set out to share this with my colleagues. And I, again, was told I was leading people to danger by even making them aware that there's different ways to view race, that we don't have to be locked into a box. And I think that that's something that's key. Whenever I see a learning situation where someone says people shouldn't learn about this or that, it concerns me, because what's that about? What do we have to hide? What is the danger in learning something new? The danger is people's minds becoming free and them beginning to do what Dr. Goldfarb said, seeing each person as an individual with unique experiences and being willing to really get to know each other in more authentic ways. This viewpoint of the critical social justice, it sets people up based on their identities and calls them experts on topics. When it's just simply not the case. And it tells us, to view each other, like I might look at Dr. Goldfarb and say, you're a white man. You could never understand, how to view the world, and see the world from my experience as a Black woman. We can get in these camps and tell each other we'll never understand each other. And, that some of us should be silent while others are allowed to speak. Or we can create a space where everyone has, the levity to speak and share and be heard. So it's the choices that we make in what we're doing to each other and what we're doing in terms of the worldviews we're promoting or not promoting.
It's interesting when you talk about such folks, as far back, 100 years ago, Booker T. Washington had a favorite quote about race hustlers. and that there were a certain group of folks, race, as they call them, the race problem solvers, who don't want the patient to get well. And that's the same boat we're in right now. I think the way you put it, that is, I almost hate to say this phrase because it's gotten so overused, but we're all in this together. And, but somehow people will kind of blurt that out, but they don't really mean it when they start dividing us in little groups. And I think the approach you talked about, we're looking at as individuals, as all part of the human race, I certainly believe is the right one. And I'm sure there's many others who think like you. Now, you're also involved with Free Black Thought. Tell us about that and how that group got started.
Yes. So I'm thankful to be one of the co-founders of Free Black Thought. So in the midst of all of the things that were happening early on, a couple of organizations really stepped to the plate and helped ground me and give me community that outside of the kind of wild environment that I found myself in, the wild, wild west out there in Silicon Valley. So one was Free Black Thought and the other was Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. And both of them were with me early on. Free Black Thought is an organization that is committed to elevating heterodox or non-mainstream perspectives about Black culture and life. Because as we see under critical social justice approach, there's a very monolithic type of viewpoint where people say Black people think this, or Latino people think Y or X. It puts us in these boxes, and we have these non-elected representatives of social organizations who are supposed to represent us, and there really is diversity of thought in the Black community. And even in, how do we even define the Black community? You have people who come from Africa who come to America and they say, oh my gosh, what is this? People are calling me Black and I don't even know what they mean. I don't identify with that. I'm from Nigeria or from, wherever else they may be from. And it's a different experience. So in America, we have this, this long history with race, with now attempting to, paint people as a monolith when it's just not true. There's such diversity in every single group, grouping that's been made by sociologists and demographic analysts. So that's what the purpose is. And so giving those voices, and I was one of those voices that wasn't mainstream. And so it's been a wonderful experience just being in community, with the board there and the community members, and as well, getting the support from Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. Their legal advocacy team has been key. That's who's representing me, the case, for about the issues that happened at Anza.
Well, I just speaking for myself, but I think probably for a good part of the audience, this kind of conversation is so useful and helpful, and we're really appreciative of your bringing to us some of these ideas that you've thought about so deeply and in such interesting ways. So thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you. And please just tell our audience your two websites.
Yes. So one would be the Free Black Thought website. And then on drtlee.com is where you can find the links to the race ideologies, resources, and other resources that have been posted for people. One of the things I did that I got in trouble for was I ran a student workshop. And it was one of my evaluated things for my tenure review committee members. And I did the Race Ideologies interactive workshop with the students. And the comments from the students, when they realized, they said, oh my goodness, we've only been taught a neo-reconstructionist understanding of race this whole time in our program. No one's ever told us there's different ways to see this. And they said, thank you so much. Because some things felt uncomfortable to me and I didn't know why and I couldn't name it. So they were happy to be able to name and to be aware that there are different ways to view the topic that had never been taught to them. So the reception from students was very positive. Reception from faculty members who were kind of deeply entrenched in ideology, well, we see where that has landed me. So
Well, thank you so much for telling us your story. And I think it's going to inspire other people to speak out, because that's what we need. Sometimes people feel like they're the lone voice and they're out there all alone. Well, like you were, with everyone ganging up on you. So for everybody out there who thinks like Dr. Lee, hey, there's somebody else. And there's lots of somebody else's. So thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank everyone for listening and supporting our efforts to protect the patients and doctors and healthcare itself from this sort of divisive ideology. Please visit us at donoharmmedicine.org. And thanks again for listening.